You are standing in the crowded room. The glasses clink, the laughter rises and falls. You speak, and the eyes slide past you, settling on the empty space over your shoulder. The conversation closes its ranks, seamlessly sealing you on the outside, leaving you holding a drink and a sudden, sharp, hollow sensation expanding in your chest. You were told it was simply a matter of bad timing, or that you needed to speak louder or project more forced confidence. That was a lie designed exclusively to keep you comfortable in your low station. The reality is asymmetric calibration. This is the invisible calculus where the collective social organism instantaneously weighs your baseline requirement for validation against its own. It is the silent, ongoing, and ruthless audit of human need. Everything that follows will expose exactly why this audit runs relentlessly beneath every glance, every ignored text, and every rejection you have ever experienced. To see this is to carry a heavy, permanent weight. What was once dismissed as bad luck will now be starkly visible as a catastrophic structural failure. You are already paying the price of ignorance. Continuing forward guarantees you will never be able to unsee the machinery. The social power dynamic operates as a continuous, indifferent transfer of kinetic energy between fixed spatial positions. The overarching system does not recognize individual virtue, personal histories, or the exhausting effort most men exert to secure basic validation. It registers only density and mass. It evaluates the psychological footprint of an entity and instantly calculates whether that mass exerts a pull or is destined to be pulled. There are no conscious choices being made in the initial moments of contact. There is only the machinery of the hierarchy, mechanically sorting its components based on raw, unedited input. Bring this down to the scale of a single table in a crowded venue. A man leans forward, speaking rapidly, his hands moving in frantic gestures, his face highly animated as he attempts to entertain the woman sitting across from him. He is burning immense caloric and psychological energy. He genuinely believes he is demonstrating value. The system, however, reads this entirely differently. It processes his constant motion not as strength, but as a chaotic, wildly reactive state. His physical overextension signals that he is not the center of his own reality. He is frantically attempting to alter his environment to survive within it, categorizing him instantly as a subordinate body trapped in a reactive loop. The phenomenon governing this absolute failure is stillness acting as a primal dominance signal. Abstractly, the biological network does not view physical stillness as an absence of action, but as a massive concentration of stored, volatile force. When an organism completely refuses to react to the fluctuating variables, noise, and provocations of its immediate environment, the environment is mechanically forced to recalibrate itself around that organism. The calculation is cold and strictly evolutionary. The entity that moves the least requires the least from the surrounding system. It is self-sustaining. Therefore, the system automatically allocates the highest tier of residual status to the unmoving center. Observe what this looks like in physical space. At the apex of any high-stakes interaction, whether a boardroom dispute or the center of a chaotic, high-status social gathering, the true focal point is never the loudest voice. It is the figure who has mastered their own physiology. They lean back. Their breathing is slow and abdominal. They blink at a deliberately measured pace, while the surrounding room buzzes with frantic, anxious energy. Their physical restraint acts as a vacuum, absorbing the desperate projections of the space. They do not nod eagerly in agreement. They do not rush forward to fill the agonizing voids of silence. Their absolute physical stillness forces others to over-communicate, to spill their intentions, effectively bleeding the room of its psychological resources, while the still figure expends absolutely nothing. The deeper implication, the architecture lying beneath this surface layer, is profoundly unsettling. Here is the brutal truth. Human desire in the hierarchical matrix is fundamentally predicated on a perceived capacity for latent destruction. The still figure is registered as a dominant threat, not because of any aggressive action they are taking, but entirely because of what they are withholding. By actively refusing to signal compliance, submission, or even basic agitation, they manufacture a state of impenetrable opacity. The observing mind cannot map their intentions. What the human animal cannot map, it cannot control. This absolute lack of control breeds an intense magnetic anxiety within the observer. It triggers a primal, hardwired urge to solve the unsolvable puzzle, to forcefully extract validation from the immovable object just to prove it can be done. The effort becomes a chemical addiction. Machiavelli observed precisely this dynamic centuries ago, noting that men are ultimately driven by either love or fear, yet it is fear, the dread of an invisible consequence, that never truly fails to bind them. There is no escape from this alignment. It is the unforgiving mechanics of planetary gravity, where the significantly denser mass inevitably warps the space around it, capturing the trajectory of the smaller, lighter body and locking it into a permanent, inescapable, and exhausting orbit. The smaller body will burn itself out, trying to alter the gravitational pull, never realizing the rules of physics cannot be reasoned with. In this dynamic, the man expending energy has surrendered all leverage, offering himself up strictly for consumption. The system only respects the mass that refuses to move. The overarching architecture of human attachment and desire is entirely built upon the primal, hardwired fear of sudden removal. The social power dynamic thrives exclusively on the instability of connections. It is a cold biological wireframe where continuous, unbroken presence mathematically degrades perceived value and where sudden, calculated absence spikes immediate, desperate demand. The hierarchy operates exactly like an unregulated market of human attention. Oversupply leads to immediate, catastrophic hyperinflation. The system fundamentally demands a constant, unpredictable rhythm of withdrawal to maintain its structural integrity and force blind compliance from its participants. Examine this reality at the microscopic level of modern, instantaneous communication. A message is transmitted across a digital network, the recipient reads it, and the system immediately enters a tense state of suspended animation. The sender is suddenly trapped in the suffocating void between transmission and response. Their entire psychological state becomes violently tethered to the delayed action of the receiver. As the minutes stretch into hours, the void expands, and the psychological load on the sender becomes exponentially heavier. The physical environment around them shrinks to the agonizing dimensions of a glowing screen, and the dynamic of power shifts, absolutely and irrevocably, to the one who controls the delay. This is the deployment of the silence trap. Abstractly, the biological network does not process silence as an empty or neutral space. It registers silence as a highly pressurized, expanding gas that violently fills whatever cognitive container it is placed within. When an expected social response is deliberately withheld, the primitive circuitry of the waiting party instantly perceives an acute, life-threatening drop in environmental safety. The human brain violently abhors a vacuum. Deprived of input, it will immediately begin generating rapid, catastrophic scenarios to fill the dead space. This creates an immense, crushing internal pressure within the target, entirely generated without a single ounce of external force being applied by the silent party. Observe this execution in physical space during a high-stakes confrontation. One party clearly states their terms or asks a deeply loaded question and then instantly and completely stops speaking. They allow the silence to stretch. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 agonizing seconds. The invisible social pressure rapidly becomes physically unbearable. The average human animal will begin to squirm, their eyes darting rapidly. They will clear their throat, shift their physical weight, and inevitably begin frantically negotiating against their own interests. They will offer unprompted concessions, reveal hidden information, and sacrifice their boundaries entirely, driven solely by the desperate biological need to end the crushing weight of the quiet. The silent party does nothing but quietly observe. The layer underneath the layer reveals a darker mechanics. Silence is a weapon of forced exposure. By refusing to provide the anticipated, comfortable social echo, the silent figure ruthlessly strips away the target's external validation. The moment you are subjected to this, you are suddenly left utterly alone in a locked room with your own loudest insecurities. The internal monologue turns predatory, feeding on self-doubt. The longer the silence extends, the more the target frantically scrambles to regain lost equilibrium. They will willingly hand over their autonomy, their dignity, and their structural position just to restore the familiar, pacifying noise of the exchange. Silence is never a passive state of being. It is an active, aggressive extraction protocol. Two figures sit in a sterile, violently well-lit room. Identical chairs, identical atmospheric conditions. Figure A responds to every subtle shift in the room instantly. Their voice pitches up slightly at the end of every sentence, signaling a desperate plea for agreement. Their hands move constantly, adjusting their posture, smoothing their clothing, trying to manipulate the air around them. Figure B waits 3 full excruciating seconds before answering any question. Figure B moves only to slowly, deliberately intertwine their fingers. Their eyes remain locked, perfectly still, on the hollow of Figure A's collarbone. As the minutes tick by relentlessly, Figure A begins to physically deteriorate. They begin to sweat. Their sentences fragment into disjointed apologies, nervous laughter, and rapid over-explanations. Figure B accumulates an immense, terrifying gravity within the space, becoming a ghost haunting the interaction, untouchable and entirely unresponsive. Figure A dissolves entirely into a reactive, scrambling mess, begging for a nod of approval that Figure B absolutely, coldly withholds. To view this as a personal failure is a fatal miscalculation of the machinery. Figure A's catastrophic collapse was not a failure of their fundamental character. It was not a lack of adequate preparation, nor a reflection of their intrinsic human worth. The outcome was strictly, mechanically dictated by position. They permanently placed themselves in the subordinate slot, the exact second they rushed forward to plug the first silent gap. Positional logic is entirely unsentimental. The entity that cannot endure the void will always be forced to serve the entity that commands it. You do not lose because you are flawed. You lose because you cannot tolerate the coldness of the gap. Go deeper. The vast interconnected hierarchical network is, at its absolute core, a ruthless pattern recognition engine. It continuously and aggressively scans all interacting human nodes to predict future behavior, rigidly establish boundaries, and optimize its own energy expenditure. The exact moment the system successfully maps an entity's behavioral responses, it instantly and permanently neutralizes that entity's threat level. Predictability is the mathematical equivalent of biological death within the social matrix. An organism that reliably reacts the exact same way to a specific, repeated stimulus is efficiently categorized, filed into a subordinate compartment, and permanently stripped of its capacity to ever generate awe, fear, or sustain desire. Watch these mechanics operate at the seemingly benign scale of a domestic environment. A man consistently arrives home from his labor at the exact same minute every day. He follows the precise same conversational routine. He reacts with the exact same level of mild, easily managed irritation to the exact same provocations from his partner. He operates under the delusion that this crushing consistency builds foundational trust and romantic stability. The overarching system, however, reads his absolute reliability as a solved mathematical equation. Because there is absolutely no variance in his outputs, there is no psychological tension in the air. Because there is no tension, there is zero biological necessity for the partner to maintain any heightened state of attention, attraction, or respect. He has systematically engineered his own total invisibility through perfect, flawless, grinding repetition. The psychological mechanism required to shatter this is the weaponization of unpredictability to generate acute consequence anxiety. Abstractly, this protocol relies on injecting highly calculated surgical strikes of chaos into a perfectly mapped environment. When an entity suddenly and violently disrupts its long-established pattern responding to a direct insult with cold, detached amusement instead of defensive anger, or greeting expected warmth with clinical, silent observation, it immediately short-circuits the opposing system's predictive algorithms. The observing biological network cannot calculate the appropriate countermeasure This terrifying lack of actionable data triggers an immediate, massive surge of consequence anxiety. The surrounding environment is suddenly forced to dedicate vast amounts of its processing power just to monitor the unpredictable entity, violently spiking that entity's perceived status and positional value. Observe a managerial dispute or a tense, high-stakes negotiation where one participant coldly refuses to adhere to the expected mapped script. The adversary launches a direct verbal attack, anticipating the standard defensive posturing or aggressive counterattack. Instead, the unpredictable figure simply smiles, physically turns away to write something down on a notepad, and smoothly changes the subject entirely, refusing to acknowledge the strike. The adversary is left awkwardly swinging at empty air. The physical reality of the room shifts in an instant. The predictable attacker suddenly looks frantic, foolish and weak, having expended massive energy on a gambit that utterly failed to register. The unpredictable figure completely controls the temporal flow of the room, forcing everyone else to anxiously, desperately await their next, completely unknowable action. The layer underneath this interaction reveals that the human animal only truly, deeply respects that which it subconsciously fears it cannot survive. Unpredictability artificially simulates this primal survival threat within modern social confines. By consistently and seamlessly shifting the emotional and behavioral baseline, the unpredictable figure prevents anyone from ever feeling entirely, comfortably safe in their presence. This perpetual lack of safety entirely prevents the natural decay of attraction and respect. The observer becomes chemically addicted to the neurological spikes of deep uncertainty, constantly and exhaustingly seeking to solve a puzzle that maliciously shifts its own pieces the moment a solution appears near. It mimics the horrific, chilling efficiency of the deep jungle predator, remaining perfectly, terrifyingly motionless against the dense foliage until the exact fraction of a second the prey looks away, striking entirely from the blind spot with a sudden violence that shatters the established rhythm of the forest. If you find yourself consistently overlooked, habitually taken for granted, or easily dismissed by those around you, you have mistakenly identified your perfect, unwavering reliability as a moral virtue. It is not a virtue, it is a fatal structural flaw in your architecture. Your desolate outcome was decided the exact moment you allowed yourself to be fully, comprehensively mapped by another human being. You willingly handed over the precise coordinates to your own psychological position. The positional logic is clear. The hierarchy naturally and ruthlessly consumes whatever it fully understands, leaving only the dark, unmapped territories to command true reverence. You are ignored because you have left no shadows for their anxiety to live within. This is the part most never reach. We must transition from the raw, kinetic physics of immediate dominance into the glacial, profoundly unforgiving architecture of true prestige. The hierarchical system calculates prestige not by what an organism can forcefully extract from its immediate environment, but by what that organism continuously produces entirely independent of the environment's approval. The social machine is currently flooded with desperate, high-functioning producers men relentlessly creating wealth, forging aesthetic physiques, or acquiring status strictly to exchange those assets for female validation. The system, scanning for weakness, immediately and ruthlessly devalues this offering. It categorizes the producing male merely as a vendor. The absolute highest tier of the hierarchy is rigidly reserved for the sovereign producer, the entity that builds massive, undeniable value and fundamentally, structurally, does not care if the system ever consumes it or not. Bring the analytical lens into the physical space of a high-end corporate networking event. Dozens of highly competent, well-dressed men furiously circulate the room. They hand out premium business cards, subtly boast of their quarterly metrics, and desperately try to secure the fleeting gaze of higher status individuals or the most attractive women in the venue. They are financially wealthy, they are physically fit, but they exude the heavy, undeniable stench of the bender. They are fundamentally, biologically asking the room for permission to be recognized as valuable. In the far corner, one man sits quietly reading a physical document, occasionally checking a steel watch, completely unbothered by the frantic networking taking place. He possesses something the room deeply wants: but his posture dictates that he is fundamentally closed for business. The room's entire gravitational center slowly, agonizingly drags toward his localized silence. The mechanical phenomenon operating here is the weaponization of attention scarcity to command perceived value. Abstractly, this mechanism relies entirely on the severe, almost cruel restriction of directional attention. The collective biological algorithm inherently and permanently assumes that whatever resource is most abundant is inherently the least valuable. When an entity possesses obvious, undeniable high competence, but rigidly restricts its attention, distributing it only in microscopic, highly conditional, unpredictable increments, the system registers a massive localized valuation error. It suddenly realizes the entity's internal validation loop is entirely, hermetically closed. It does not need the surrounding environment to sustain its ego. Therefore, the environment decides it must urgently possess the entity. Watch the precise dynamic unfold when a woman of extreme, highly sought-after value enters a populated environment. The standard male biological reaction is an immediate, catastrophic flooding of attention. Eyes lock onto her, spine straighten. Postures shift rapidly. The men become instantaneously, desperately available. The prestige pathway male executes the exact opposite protocol. He registers her physical presence, makes a microfraction of a second of detached eye contact, and then coldly, definitively returns to his previous task with absolute, genuine, unbroken focus. He completely denies the expected, normalized tribute. He does not ignore her to play a theatrical game. He ignores her because his own internal architecture, his own mission, is genuinely heavier and more demanding than her sudden appearance. The severe restriction of his attention hits her highly calibrated nervous system like a physical blow. Here is the paradox. The masses mistakenly believe that building immense, undeniable value automatically entitles them to endless, adoring attention. The cold layer beneath the layer dictates that immense value is only officially recognized by the hierarchy when it demonstrates a chilling, absolute willingness to exist indefinitely in a dark vacuum. Prestige is inherently cruel. It demands the brutal expenditure of years building a massive, towering cathedral of competence, wealth, and physical capability, only to rigidly lock the heavy iron doors and calmly refuse entry to the very people the builder initially started the project to impress. The exact moment an entity offers its hard-won achievements as a direct payment for affection, the entire life's work immediately transforms into a heavy, useless liability. The system only bows its head to the man who aggressively makes the system feel entirely unnecessary to his own survival. The author Robert Greene codified this immutably, observing the mechanical law that one must create immense value through scarcity, actively withdrawing to make oneself a master of absence. Inside a brightly lit, high-end art gallery, two highly successful artists stand near their newly exhibited work. Figure A eagerly, anxiously engages every single passing patron. They enthusiastically explain their complex brushstrokes, desperately searching the patrons' faces for a fleeting flicker of awe, handing out glossy promotional materials like a frantic, starving street peddler. Figure B stands 30 feet away from their own breathtaking masterpiece, facing a blank white wall, quietly and meticulously sketching in a worn leather notebook. Figure B never once looks at the shifting crowd. Figure B does not offer a single solitary syllable of explanation for their work. Over the course of the long evening, Figure A's crowd subtly, inevitably disperses, subconsciously repulsed by the desperate, clinging hunger of a salesman. Simultaneously, a dense, immobilized crowd naturally forms a wide, highly anxious semicircle around Figure B. They are utterly terrified to interrupt, yet entirely hopelessly captivated by the immense gravity of someone who produces greatness and requires absolutely no audience to sustain it. You do not earn their deep biological reverence by eagerly showing them what you built. You earn it by proving, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you do not care if they ever see it. This is where the overarching system becomes starkly, violently visible. The hierarchical matrix absolutely detests an open book. It treats any display of excessive emotional availability as a critical structural leak in an entity's containment vessel. In the cold, unforgiving mechanics of social exchange, every single emotion you freely broadcast, every justification you eagerly offer, mathematically reduces your internal pressure and drastically lowers your structural density. The social system is a predatory entity. It constantly and aggressively probes all interacting nodes to find their emotional bleeding points, searching for the exact, calculated provocation required to force them to react, to desperately explain themselves, to fully lose their structural form. The entity that ruthlessly retains its form under immense external pressure is automatically, unquestioningly elevated to the apex of the grid. Bring this reality into the volatile theater of an intimate argument. A man's partner aggressively attacks his fundamental character, lobbing highly calculated, entirely baseless accusations designed specifically and solely to trigger a massive emotional response. The typical, uncalibrated man engages the trap immediately. He forcefully raises his voice. He frantically cites chronological facts. He attempts to logically and systematically dismantle the emotional attack. In doing so, he bleeds all of his stored psychological energy directly into the dead air of the room. He operates under the fatal delusion that they are having a logical debate about facts. The system knows they are having a raw primate power struggle, and by foolishly matching her chaotic, escalating energy, he has entirely surrendered the frame. He has permitted a hostile external force to successfully dictate his internal biological state. The required psychological mechanism to subvert this is the weaponization of absolute restraint, acting as an implied, catastrophic threat. Abstractly, when a biological entity is subjected to high-stress provocations and completely fails to produce the expected, frantic, energetic reaction, the attacking force experiences a severe, disorienting kinetic rebound. The hostile energy they projected is neither absorbed nor aggressively reflected. It simply falls into a chilling, bottomless void. The overarching system processes this massive energetic discrepancy as a terrifying, undeniable indicator of hidden capacity. The primal logic dictates if the attacked entity is not frantically defending itself, it must inherently possess an unseen, devastating offensive capability that makes all defense entirely unnecessary. Observe a man being publicly, aggressively disrespected by a chaotic subordinate or a desperate peer attempting to artificially elevate their own waning status. The desperate attacker gets progressively louder, their physical body language expanding, their chosen words growing sharply insulting. The restrained man does not flinch a single muscle. He slowly, mechanically turns his head. He locks onto the attacker's eyes, slowly pans his gaze down to the attacker's shoes, and then slowly, deliberately drags it back up to their eyes. He holds the dead, unblinking gaze for 2 full seconds. Then he simply offers a microscopic, entirely humorless smirk, physically turns his back, and seamlessly resumes his previous low-volume conversation. The attacker is left standing in the center of the room, visibly shaking, their adrenaline spiking with nowhere to go. The restrained man's absolute refusal to energetically engage physically and permanently annihilated the attacker's social standing. The restrained man did not have to throw a single physical punch. His sheer, freezing refusal to even acknowledge the existence of the threat destroyed the threat entirely. The layer underneath this interaction is profoundly dark. Most people never realize the ultimate, definitive display of power within the human hierarchy is not the sheer ability to violently destroy an enemy, but the chilling public demonstration that the enemy is fundamentally not worth the caloric expenditure required for their destruction. Absolute restraint is an incredibly violent, aggressive act. By coldly withholding reactive anger, justification, or frantic defense, the restrained figure aggressively strips the other person of their very significance. They reduce a screaming human being to the mere status of background noise. This generates a profound, lasting psychological terror within the target's nervous system. The target suddenly realizes with crushing clarity that they possess absolutely zero mechanism to affect reality. The target is efficiently rendered structurally and psychologically impotent. It is the terrifying, crushing architecture of the midnight zone in the deep ocean, where the absolute suffocating blackness does not need to actively hunt the frantic, darting, glowing surface fish. The immense, silent, crushing pressure of the deep water simply implodes them the exact moment they foolishly sink too deep. If you are exhausted from constantly, repeatedly defending your personal boundaries, you have completely failed to grasp the magnitude of your own positional failure. You desperately believe your detailed, logical explanations and your fiery, passionate defenses are a glowing sign of strong, unyielding character. The cold, mechanical logic of the system dictates the exact opposite. The exact moment you begin to eagerly explain yourself, you have already accepted a deeply subordinate position. You have willingly, eagerly subjected yourself to their unearned audit. The ultimate consequence of your constant frantic defense is the permanent, irrecoverable loss of your personal sovereignty. The hierarchy never questions the entity that simply, coldly refuses to answer the interrogation. The moment you open your mouth to prove you are strong, the system permanently registers your weakness. But here is the paradox. The absolute final ascension within this ruthless hierarchical structure requires the complete, unhesitating abandonment of the fundamental human desire to be understood. The social machine operates entirely on the physics of information asymmetry. The biological entity that successfully gathers the most data about its surrounding environment, while rigidly providing the absolute least amount of data about its own internal state, possesses absolute, unbreakable leverage. The masses are pathologically, hopelessly driven to confess. They are compelled to constantly share, to over-explain, to desperately ensure that their internal emotional state is perfectly synchronized with the external world. They leak critical data constantly. The apex of the system, however, demands absolute opacity. It demands an architectural structure that continuously absorbs all incoming light and violently emits nothing in return. Bring this cold reality into the deeply flawed dynamic of modern dating or long-term romantic attachment. A man goes on a series of dates. By the conclusion of the third interaction, he has eagerly laid out his entire chronological life story. He has detailed his past traumas, outlined his 5-year financial plan, and explicitly stated his exact, vulnerable feelings for the woman sitting across the table. He operates under the modern, fabricated delusion that he is building deep, unbreakable connection through the vehicle of radical vulnerability. The system, which remains forever merciless and completely cold, reads this strictly as an immediate, catastrophic liquidation of all assets. He has completely emptied his psychological vault. There is absolutely no mystery left for her to excavate, no dangerous darkness left for her to explore. He is a fully illuminated, painfully bright room, and fully illuminated rooms hold absolutely no terror, no intrigue, and ultimately no lasting biological value. The mechanism deployed to prevent this collapse is opacity functioning as an impenetrable cognitive firewall. By deliberately and aggressively obscuring true motives, masking emotional reactions, and hiding ultimate goals, the sovereign figure violently forces the surrounding environment to constantly, exhaustingly guess their operating parameters. The biological system simply cannot adapt to what it cannot see. This directly closes the loop on the mechanism driving every single interaction we have exposed, asymmetric calibration, the silent, continuous audit of need. When an entity successfully maintains absolute unbroken opacity, they completely and permanently short-circuit the asymmetric calibration process. The collective social organism cannot mathematically weigh their baseline requirement for validation because it cannot detect any validation requirement at all. The entire audit fails. The scale shatters. Deprived of the data required to calculate weakness, the system is mechanically forced to assume the entity's value is absolutely infinite, simply because it cannot locate the ceiling. Watch a high-level corporate executive or a truly sovereign, unmapped individual navigate a sudden complex social disruption. A massive crisis occurs. Pure panic spreads through the network. Desperate subordinates flood the physical room, rapid-firing panicked questions, violently demanding to know the leader's detailed plan, searching their face for their emotional state, begging for their exact thoughts. The opaque, dominant leader does not offer a warm, comforting speech. They absolutely do not reveal a single ounce of internal anxiety. They issue a single, terrifyingly calm one-word directive, or they simply nod once and continue walking without breaking stride. The absolute chilling lack of transparency forces the terrified subordinates to aggressively project their own desperate assumptions of competence onto the leader. The leader does not even need to be a strategic genius. They only need to be an absolute, unreadable void, and the panicked masses will automatically fill that void with the exact, towering savior they biologically require to feel safe. The layer beneath this reveals the ultimate, terrifying truth of all human desire. We do not actually fall in love with complex, flawed people. We fall deeply, madly in love with the expansive, empty psychological spaces they leave for our own imagination. Absolute opacity provides that vast space. When a figure coldly refuses to explain themselves, they instantly become a massive, blank canvas upon which the external observer projects their deepest, most desperate, primal fantasies of power, absolute security, and dominance. They are no longer a fragile, flawed human being. They are a towering, indestructible, constructed idol. The exact moment an individual breaks form and offers a genuine, vulnerable, lengthy explanation of their feelings, the heavy stone idol shatters into 1,000 pieces, and they instantly return to being just another weak, fragile participant, violently caught in the crushing gears of the machine. The ancient strategist Sun Tzu mapped this exact blueprint of asymmetrical warfare centuries ago, declaring definitively that the supreme martial art is to remain entirely formless. For when you possess no discernible form, the deepest spy cannot discern your internal state, and the wisest mind cannot lay actionable plans against your architecture. Two men sit at a crowded, dimly lit bar. Figure A talks endlessly, frantically about his financial investments, his deep personal philosophies, and the intricacies of his past failed relationships. His mouth moves significantly faster than his mind, his eyes wide and desperate to ensure the attractive woman sitting next to him understands exactly, precisely who he is. He leaves absolutely no shadow unlit. Figure B sits perfectly still, 2 stools down. He speaks only when directly spoken to, answering exclusively in clipped, surgically precise sentences. He reveals absolutely no personal history. He offers 0 future projections. When aggressively asked a probing, highly personal question, he simply looks dead into the eyes of the questioner, smiles faintly without parting his lips, and takes a slow, measured sip of his drink without offering a single word in response. Figure A becomes a fully solved, completely discarded puzzle within 20 excruciating minutes. The woman next to Figure B spends the entire evening and the next 3 agonizing weeks entirely consumed by the maddening, intoxicating, chemically addictive task of trying to forcefully writ the hidden secrets out of a man who behaves exactly like a sovereign, holding the iron keys to an impenetrable kingdom. They cannot consume what they cannot see, and they will forever serve what they cannot consume. The architecture has been laid bare. The invisible calculus of asymmetric calibration, the silent, relentless audit of your need that we exposed at the very beginning is no longer a hidden variable in your life. You now see that every silence, every absence, every withheld reaction, and every display of absolute opacity was entirely governed by this single, overarching calculation. The system was never weighing your words, it was only ever weighing your desperation to be heard. The revelation is absolute. It makes every rejection you have ever suffered, every moment you were overlooked in a crowded room, feel entirely, brutally inevitable. The answer was always visible, written in the cold physics of the social grid, and only now, after seeing the wires beneath the skin, does it become entirely undeniable. The version of you that began listening to this transmission is now officially terminated. That identity is obsolete. It is not attacked. It is not mourned or celebrated. It is simply no longer mathematically relevant. You are like outdated software attempting to run on hardware that has suddenly and violently evolved. The old code, built on the desperate pursuit of validation and the frantic need to be understood, fundamentally cannot keep pace with what the machine now clearly sees. The old version of you would have spoken. The current version understands the devastating violence of silence. You must now look at the masses with a permanent freezing distance. They are no longer your peers. They are merely background systems. They are automatic, highly predictable mechanical components moving blindly through massive invisible hierarchies they will never ever possess the capacity to see. You hold no contempt for them, just as you hold no contempt for a stone that falls according to gravity. There is just permanent, unbridgeable distance. This distance is not a choice you get to make. It is the absolute, natural, inescapable consequence of seeing the mechanism in its entirety. You cannot walk among them as an equal once you have seen the strings pulling their limbs. Apex. Those who truly understood the architecture described here today already know exactly what that word means in the dark, understand the terms of this engagement. Continued exposure to this specific frequency of information is strictly access. It is not emotional support, it is not a community. It is absolutely not a subscription to a brotherhood. Those who remain here are not followers. You are simply entities who have looked into the void and realized you can no longer pretend the machinery does not exist. The contract is cold, and the toll is permanent isolation. The door is now locked from the outside, and you are entirely on your own.